We're going to try to set out some of the themes that we're going to be exploring over the course of the day today. And a place to start is with the history of how we found ourselves, where we find ourselves. And in the piece that Margaret referred to a few minutes ago, Ta-Nehisi, that you did for the magazine, you locate the modern origins of the era of mass incarceration in the famous report by Daniel Patrick Moynihan on the breakdown of the black family. And he intended something very different with that report than what happened. And when Lyndon Johnson first rolled it out, he said of family breakdown, he said, for this, most of all, white America must accept responsibility. He said it flows from centuries of oppression and persecution of the Negro man. So how is it that this well-intended report resulted in mass incarceration?
Well, you know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as you said, wow, that's incredible. Okay. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as James, you can hear me now? Okay, all right, beautiful. as James mentioned, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he wrote the Moynihan report, his intention really was, you know, to address the myriad of discrepancies and divides between black America and white America. And he was someone who was very, very much obsessed with the idea of families. He had looked at families among Irish Catholic communities and kind of imported that approach to African American communities. The report was not, you know, authored, you know, in any way to father malevolent policy or malevolent investment in African American communities. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was interested in employment programs, in, you know, all sorts of ways of helping families. And instead, what we got is, you know, as he was arguing for benevolent investment, instead what we got is malevolent investment. And I think that one of the things that happened, and what I argue in the piece, is that the society was already angled a certain way. The society already viewed African American families through a particular lens. And so whereas we, you know, often think about, you know, in the wake of the 1960s, the state actually retreating out of the lives of African American families and out of the lives of poor families, less investment in you know, what we would call the welfare state. In fact, there's actually been more investment, but it's been malevolent investment, you know. And you can talk about the fact that, for instance, in the Moynihan report, a lot of the solutions that, you know, he thought that we should embrace were not actually published within the report. And so we, in fact, made up our own solutions. And no solution has, you know, become, you know, more prominent. No solution has been more disastrous than this policy of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is our solution for, I argue, for employment issues in the African American community. It's the, you know, a solution that we choose to use for mental health issues very often in the African American community. And until relatively recently, it was a solution that we used for, you know, drug issues in the African American community. There was a piece in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, and it was talking about how heroin use was rising among white people in this country, this alarming rise of heroin use. And I could not help but note the very sympathetic and benevolent tone that was taken when, you know, you talked about heroin use among white people, and compare that to the time in which I grew up in the 1980s, when we were very, very much worried about crack. And I grew up in the community. I was worried about crack too, but the tone was not benevolent. It was not sympathetic. In large part, it was an argument for incarceration. And so I don't think you can separate the solutions away from how we view folks.
What is the, talk about that a little bit. Crime rates were much higher in the 60s and 70s, right, when the country embarked on this. Yeah. But you also have made the argument that, as you were just alluding to, that this fear of crime was actually connected to a deeper history of the portrayal of black criminality in this country.
So one of the things, like when I started doing the article, I lived through the rise in crime. There was no disputing that crime, you know, rose during the 90s. I was in West Baltimore. I knew how my parents understood the neighborhood when they were growing up and how they understood it when I was growing up. There was no real dispute that crime had risen. But one of the mysteries of connecting crime and incarceration is the fact that, in fact,
sorry, everybody, we're sorting out the audio,
sorry about this.
Obviously. We'll get it.
One of the discrepancies for me was, in fact, when you draw back and you look at the world as a whole during that period, in fact, crime did not just rise in African American communities, and it did not even just rise in America. And in fact, it rose in Canada, It rose in England. It rose in the Nordic countries. This was an international phenomenon. The United States is unique for embracing incarceration as a solution. And that's like the real miss. Like, why did we do that? And I think, very much, in our thinking is the idea that if people are committing crimes, jail is the best way to address it. But that's a unique, and especially the draconian reliance on jail. I'm talking double, triple life, like that sort of. I'm not, completely against the idea of jailing, people who are a danger to the community, but the draconian nature in which we do it is very, very, very different. How did we end up with 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population? How do we end up with a situation where, we have an incarceration rate of 700 per 100,000, where only 40 years ago we had an incarceration rate of about 160 per 100,000? How do we end up with a situation where our nearest competitor is Russia with an incarceration rate of 450 per 100,000? Not really a competition at all. What exactly happened? And I don't think that can be separated from the fact that we have a very, very unique population in this country, African Americans, 40 million, and a very, very unique history with that group of people.
We actually have a video that we'd like to play quickly now that establishes a lot of the statistics and describes the moment at which we now find ourselves. The narrator is Bruce Western. Do you want to say a word about who he is?
Bruce is a pioneer. Bruce Western is a sociologist at Harvard, affiliated with the Kennedy School, and when I went to write this article, he was the first person I went to talk to. So he is very much the intellectual godfather of this piece. I think you will see why in a minute.
Can we roll the video, please?
It means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration, historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event, and that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9. The research shows that kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out, and there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Okay, we're going to be taking questions from the audience throughout the day, and I'm going to open it up to you guys in just a moment here. I think Mike's moving around the room after I ask one more question of Ta-Nehisi, which is, okay, so maybe take us from where the video left off. The Moynihan report was issued with the goal of trying to help do something about the problem of family breakdown. What were the consequences for the family of the policy that the country wound up pursuing?
Well, there were no immediate consequences of the report in the sense that what Moynihan hoped to do was spark a conversation. And,
No, but I mean the consequences of mass incarceration.
oh, yes,
for
yes, yes, of
family.
course, of course.
Would you say that? Yeah.
Of course. They've been devastating. I think Bruce just outlined the case right there. When you were talking about 1 in 10 parents, 1 in 9, children having, parents in jail, that is a deprivation of human power within the household. Kids take a lot of energy. You take a parent out, that's a problem. We have statistics in the story, I believe, at this point, 50%, of folks who are arrested and have children, African-American males that are arrested and have children, are actually living in the household at the time. I don't think this necessarily has to be a conversation about doing nothing. I don't think that's what anybody's, saying in terms of, when we have crimes within our community. But the quickness with which we go to prison, the quickness with which we go to, as Bruce pointed out in there, the deprivation of liberty, because that's what prison is, and the quickness with which we go to it for a community that historically has been deprived of liberty in this country, really, I think, should shame us all.
Are there questions from the audience? Here we go.
Okay, my name is Mark Carr, and my organization is Social Solutions, and we're working on an initiative to reduce the incarceration rate in Washington, D.C. by half in 5 years. But my question to you, Ta-Nehisi, is that as an avid historian, and in your years of researching and reading about race relations in the United States, specifically concerning incarceration, what was the thing that really struck you in your research? What really popped out? What surprised you? What startled you? What made you afraid?
The thing that strikes me is how old it actually is. I think a lot of studies of mass incarceration, and to some extent even mine, begin in the 60s and the 70s. And I guess you begin there because that's the period where you see this huge increase in just the number of people who are going into the system. But the fact of the matter is dealing with problems in the African American community through criminal justice, through the deprivation of liberty, through incarcerating people in some sort of form, is actually a very, very old solution. When folks made arguments for the abolition of slavery, the first thing people would say is, you can't free these people, they are more likely to commit crimes. When people wanted to justify lynching, the first thing they said was, we lynch because this populace is more likely to commit crime. When folks wanted to justify housing segregation and keeping African Americans from having access to certain neighborhoods that other people in this country had access, crime was always a part of it. Crime was an argument against integration. And so one of the arguments I make is, if a society tells itself repeatedly over a number of centuries that a society is in fact like an entity, like a living person, and if you tell yourself a story about a group of people over a long period of time, eventually it becomes very, very easy to believe it. And so when you see an increase in crime, whereas we would respond certain, in one way, if there were a different narrative for a different group of people, because there's already a pre-existing narrative of African Americans as criminal, it becomes, very, very easy to respond with incarceration. One of the very, very sad things, when you talk about Moynihan is, you see, this guy who, at least in the report, was trying to be benevolent, believed in, benevolent investment, and then within 5 or 6 years, he's in the Nixon administration, and he's making the very same arguments for black criminality. That shows you, when you can even get to somebody who's supposed to be on your side, who is sympathetic to you, that shows you that there is a deep, deep undercurrent, a narrative that is already there.
One of the really striking things you unearthed to demonstrate how incarceration has been a system of social control, I thought, was the varying rates of incarceration over the course of the 20th century in the North versus the South.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is like, if we consider 1970 as a sort of, baseline idea, and there's some evidence for that, incarceration rates in America about 160, 400,000 in 1970. By the time, we get to our time right now, we're, somewhere in the neighborhood of 700. And you think, well, if I can just get back to 1970, everything would be okay. But then when you start looking at it long term, across the course of the 20th century, what you find is, in fact, in northern cities, incarceration rates for African Americans have always been really, really high. Now, they didn't need to be high in southern cities because, pre-1970 or so, the South was essentially a police state. Segregation was the mode of social control in the South. The ratio of incarceration, black to white, in our northern cities, in Detroit, in New York, in Chicago, taken all together, was roughly a 7-to-1 ratio black to white. The ratio today is about the same, which shows that even as we've added more people into the system, the basic mechanism has not really changed too much. And I think that presents just a profound challenge for all of us who are here who are interested in decarceration. We are not just dealing with something that suddenly popped up on us out of nowhere in the 1970s. We are dealing with something that is much, much more deep-rooted, I suggest.
And as Jim Crow is dismantled in the South, the incarceration rate in the South rose to be the same levels in the North.
And in fact, actually shoots way above the northern cities, in fact.
Go over here, please.
Good morning. Charles Thornton, Officer on Return to Citizen Affairs. It's no doubt that mass incarceration has had a devastating effect on the black community and in black neighborhoods. And the landscape now is that, you know, with all of the information that's coming out, we really can see, you know, where when you get, you know, Michelle Alexander, we having these forums. My question is more centered around, you know, so there's 2.3 million people incarcerated, but around 700,000 return annually.
That's right.
And it does not seem to be any focus and any systems being put in place on how to deal with the 700,000 that return, as well as the 70% of those that go back.
Right.
Because of the fact that there's really not a lot of systems being put in place, and that 70% is that recidivism rate that I'm talking about. So my question is, how do we begin to look at, you know, affecting the recidivism rate and what we need to do to you know, to try to, you know, get some of these men and women to stay home?
We have a huge structural problem. I think Diva Page is here, and in her book, Marked, she makes the point that I think, you know, every year enough prisoners come out of prison, come out of jail to fill every fast food job in America 5 times over. That is like incredibly scary. I mean, if you're gonna, and I think about this all the time, if you talk about decarceration, but are we gonna send these folks back to these very same besieged communities? Folks, you know, who are incarcerated come from particular communities that are facing, you know, disadvantage on a number of levels across a variety of dimensions, and simply letting people out of jail and sending them back into those communities is not just unfair to them, it's actually unfair to the community also. And so while we've, you know, advanced the conversation, I think, on the idea of lowering, you know, the number of people that we have in jail, what are we prepared to do? And I think, like, this is the tough thing, because ultimately, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you really are talking about money. You really are talking about investing in those communities. I mean, there's no, you know, other way to put it. And while I see that there is, you know, and I think this day right here that has us all assembled, it says that there is some consensus, enough consensus to say, listen, where we are right now is a moral and, you know, to a large extent, economic disaster. But have we gone to the next step to say that it's not just enough to cut the numbers, that we actually have to invest in those communities? Are we there yet? I don't know.
Take one more.
Good morning. Kibibi Taihimba, and for the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. If we assume that the activism in black communities and in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and the linking of allies with white communities as well, if we assume that that has anything to do with that ramping up of the prison population, how would you compare and contrast what is going on today, where you have organizations such as Black Lives Matter, you've got the alliances beginning between black, brown, and white communities, with young students particularly? How would you compare and contrast that so that we have some idea of the hurdles that are before us?
Well, I think, and it's good to see you, I think we're at a very interesting moment. You know, I think in many ways, you know, one can be optimistic about this moment. There is, as I said, you know, broad consensus, you know, from, you know, as you said, the Black Lives Matter movement all the way over to the Koch brothers, that, you know, we are too far gone on the issue of incarceration. I don't know that we are perceiving the depth of the problem yet, though. I don't know that we understand how bad it is. You know, we had, again, I mean, I just go back to this. I mean, we had an incarceration rate of 161, you know, per 100,000, and now we're at 700. I mean, that is a huge number. You know, it's gigantic. We have, I believe right now, on any given day, 2.2 million people in our prisons and jails. There are roughly 4 times as many people in China. We have 500,000 more people in our prisons. It's just it's a gigantic number. And one of the things we hear, and we may well hear it today, I'm going to try to set the tone and just say that we should be skeptical when we hear this, is the idea that this can happen if we just let out enough nonviolent drug offenders. And I'm all for letting out nonviolent drug offenders, but in fact, a large number of our prisoners are in state jails and state facilities. And something on the order of half, 52% of those folks have committed what we would term as violent crimes. And we have to advance the discussion on that front. You have to ask yourself, if somebody assaults somebody, if somebody in fact even kills somebody, is it worth taking their life away? Is that something that we want to do? And how does that compare with the rest of the world? How does that compare with our own history? When we have situations where we're giving people double life terms, triple life terms, like what are we actually doing there? Is punishing people as harsh as we can a necessary and an essential product when we talk about lowering crime and increasing safety in these communities? So I think we have to question some of the root levels, and I don't know that we're quite there yet.
Actually, that segues to the story I'd love you to tell to just wrap up for us here. We have a guest in the audience today, Odell Newton, who features in your story, and maybe you could tell his story. Sure,
and I won't call Odell because I don't want to embarrass Odell, but I'll definitely tell Odell's stories as best I can. Again, like for me, there were several pitfalls that I wanted to avoid when I went into the story, and I wanted to push folks to not just think about the kid who was on the corner and got caught with a nickel bag of marijuana and somehow ended up in jail for 20 years. I mean, we've heard those sorts of stories. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but stories like that all the time. And I really, really wanted to push the envelope for folks to consider, actual violent acts within the community and how we as a society respond to those acts. And so Odell Newton, many, many years ago, as a young man, in fact, as a juvenile, robbed and killed a taxi cab driver. He was given life as a juvenile, and one can consider whether we want to even give life in prison to juveniles. But at that period in time, he was given what we called life with parole, and that actually meant something. That was not something just a throwaway term. Life with parole meant within the judicial system in the state of Maryland at that time that within your period in jail, you were supposed to somehow hopefully rehabilitate yourself, and it was the possibility of you going back into your community. And at that point, in the late 60s, in the 70s, into the 80s, and even into the mid-1990s, we did have a policy where, folks, who could show that they had rehabbed their lives actually were, eventually let out of prison. Odell was recommended to be paroled from prison, I believe, on 3 different occasions by the parole board. At one point, he was actually in a program where he was allowed to go out and, spend time with his family on the weekends. He had jobs on the outside in Baltimore. Several of his employers said, if Odell Newton is allowed out of prison, I would hire him right away. He's a model employee. And then as we went through this period of tough on crime in the 90s, those programs were slowly drawn back. And in the state of Maryland, a deep blue state, by the way, it's very, very important that you get this. We ended up with a situation that for lifers, effectively the parole system was abolished because Maryland was unique in the sense that even no matter what the parole board ultimately recommended, the governor had to sign off. And it became an extreme political liability for a governor to sign off on a lifer, who had committed quote unquote, what we call violent crime. And I think like that poses us with several challenges. The first challenge is it poses us with understanding on some level, you can't just reduce this to quote unquote conservatives doing evil things. Part of this is, even in a deep blue state like Maryland, this is a problem. At the same time, these folks, the governors themselves are actually responding to a very, very real fear that exists within society and within communities. And the way we've addressed that fear is to completely look away. To have folks who commit crimes, even at the juvenile level, and just to kind of look away. And so I think that points to root issues that we actually have to get to. And then finally, I think it points to the fact that of how our basic institutions stopped working. We had a policy that was supposed to be true for the parole board, but the parole board basically just didn't exist for that population of prisoners. And so I think that shows how when we embrace incarceration and punitive sentencing in that sort of way, it actually leads to a situation in which our basic institutions stop functioning.
All right, Ta-Nehisi, thank you very much. And we're going to be exploring all these questions over the course of the rest of the morning and into the afternoon.
Thanks, James. Hope you guys enjoy yourself. Thank you.